Well, good afternoon, and thank you to everyone for being here in this special event within the speaker series at the college. This is the Ariel Sallows lecture delivered by the Ariel Sallows Chair, who's currently in the position. And as many of you know, the Ariel Sallows Chair in Human Rights is a wonderful endowment that the college has to bring on a regular basis someone known in the field of human rights as a visitor and visiting professor at the college. And Mary Eberts is known around the world for her groundbreaking work on behalf of women's equality, Aboriginal rights, and the Charter. She really needs no introduction, but I'll say just a few words anyway. Her education has been at the University of Western Ontario, at Harvard Law School, and current work at Toronto. She taught at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto for 6 years, from 1974 to 1980. Went then to the litigation department at Torrey's, where she became a partner 4 years thereafter. And a number of years after that, she established a small specialized litigation boutique in Toronto to engage in equality litigation across Canada. She's had many honors, but in terms of her work, she was involved with the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women to provide advice on the draft of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and became very involved in the equality rights sections there. She acted for the ad hoc committee of Canadian Women on the Constitution with respect to later constitutional issues. She acted for the Native Women's Association of Canada over a number of years as counsel and in specific cases as well. She's a co-founder of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, LEAF, the first chair of its National Legal Committee, and has acted in counsel in some of its early cases and many other important cases at the Supreme Court of Canada and other courts. So we're delighted to have her here as the Ariel Sallows Chair for the year, and delighted to have her deliver today the Ariel Sallows Lecture on this tremendously important topic of the missing and murdered Aboriginal women and settler reflections thereon. So thank you to Professor Eberts for today's lecture.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Treaty 6 people of Saskatchewan for welcoming me to your land while I teach at the University of Saskatchewan, and for having us here today. My topic today stems from work that I did the first time I held a chair, and that is in 2004 and 2005 at Ottawa University. I had the Gordon Henderson Chair in Human Rights, and I was at that time working with the Native Women's Association of Canada. They had a grant and had asked me to do some research for them on whether Section 15 of the Charter of Rights would be of help to them in challenging the disgraceful under-attention that was given to the violence against Aboriginal and Indigenous women in this country. And so I started my work on this, what I thought would be a comparative issue. How are non-Indigenous women treated and how are Indigenous women treated? And I found that I had to do a lot of research on how Indigenous women are treated. And I amassed this huge, huge file full of individual stories of Indigenous women and what had happened to them. And there were, at that point, before the Sisters in Spirit campaign of the Native Women's Association, which was just getting going, I had almost 500 stories in boxes and file cabinets in my room. And at that time, I was living in Ottawa in the top story of a skinny house that I occupied with Bev Jacobs, who is then the president of the Native Women's Association, and her husband, Sheldon Cardinal, a Cree man from Alberta. And I had my bed in the same room as all these files. And I was beginning to have a lot of trouble sleeping. I couldn't sleep at night. And I would get up and I would put a blanket around me and go out downstairs onto the porch so that I could breathe, because I couldn't breathe. And I would get these asthma attacks and I couldn't figure out why. And finally, they said to me, you're getting these asthma attacks because you're in the same room as all these women and they want you to do something. You've got to do something. And so I said, oh, okay. And as soon as I understood that, they settled down and I didn't have to go and sit out in the cold with a blanket around my shoulders in order to catch my breath. But since that time, I have been looking for a way of writing about the murdered and missing women that would be from the point of view of my own culture, and not me pretending to be an Aboriginal woman, or not me borrowing the grief and indignation and suffering of Aboriginal women. And that has been very difficult for me to get to. And finally, I figured out that one of the ways that I could do that, and this is what I have been working on now for almost a year, was to look at the famous Canadian writers. I studied English as an undergraduate, and I've returned to that discipline as my legal studies have left me kind of adrift as to what to do here. And so I have had this project going where I looked at famous Canadian writers and what they have to say about violence against Indigenous women. And the point at which I focus is that magical point in the history of Canada where we are starting to put ourselves together as a nation. So come with me to 1967, the year Canada celebrated its centennial as a nation. That year, O Canada was officially named as our national anthem, and the red maple leaf replaced the ensign as Canada's national flag. In 1967, universal health care and the Canada Pension Plan were established, and Canada student loans were set up. The Order of Canada was created and the National Library of Canada was opened. The government established the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. Only 10 years before, Lester Pearson had received the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in organizing the UN emergency force to resolve the Suez crisis, Canada had begun to think of itself as peacekeeper to the world. In 1968, Pierre Trudeau enacted the first National Divorce Act, getting Parliament out of the bedrooms of separating spouses in Quebec and Newfoundland, and soon he had passed a suite of criminal law reforms aimed at getting the state out of all the bedrooms of the nation. Soon after, in 1970, La Francophonie was established, with Canada as a founding member. That year, 1970, saw the first Canadian content rules for TV and radio from the CRTC. And in October 1970, Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act against a suspected insurrection in Quebec. At that crucial moment, just past mid-century, Canada was reconfiguring itself as a modern liberal state with a basic social support net, its own hands firmly on the instruments of a national culture, and a commitment to official English-French bilingualism and biculturalism that would be a counterweight to Quebec's aspirations for independence and to meddling like that of Charles de Gaulle, who had bellowed from a Montreal balcony in 1968, "Vive le Québec libre." So this is the moment that I want to take you to, this 1967, 68, and a little bit beyond that. And I want to get you to look with me at some Canadian literature in English. And that literature, really, for purposes of my analysis, consists of a modest collection of pieces. One is George Riga's play, The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. and the other is Margaret Lawrence's Manawanka Cycle, a set of short stories and novels in which she deals with the lives, the intertwining lives of people from Manawanka, Quebec. The centerpiece of that Manawanka Cycle is The Diviners, her famous and award-winning book, and the stories of Morag Gunn, Jules Tonnerre, their daughter Peak, and then around those stories, the related ones of the girls of Manawanka, Stacey Cameron and her sister Rachel, and so on. In looking at this small collection of mid-century literature, what I learned was that we have, as English Canadians, known in our literature, and this is not an inconsiderable literature, it has been celebrated in this nation and around the world, what we have known in a very big way has what has been happening to Native women. We cannot escape this because it is writ large all over some of the artistic productions of which we are the most proud. We know it, and yet we keep unlearning it. We are, as English Canadians, participating in what my daughter calls the alternating current of knowing and unknowing. We know it when we are reading about it, but we forget it when we are living the rest of our lives, making decisions and playing our roles of citizens and influencing public policy. My overall thesis is that you can read in these works a map of what has actually been happening for over 50 years to the Aboriginal and Indigenous women of this country. You can find in each tale written down or each stage direction more than one correspondence to the real world of the missing and murdered women. When it came time to write this research all down, it was almost as if these women from my room in Ottawa all those years ago were starting up again. I got this really bad sinus infection last week, and it closed my left eye. I have not had the sight of my left eye for a few days now. Otherwise, I would have been busy crossing my T's and making everything a neat package. Hey, I thought, what gives? What do you guys want now? But that wasn't it. It was just an eye infection, and if there is a message from the women who still inhabit many boxes and cabinets in my study, it is just do your best. Don't stay home because of this. Go and talk, because people need to hear this message. And so I decided I would come and do what I could with these eyes and these notes, and hope that I can start some thoughts that will continue having resonance and do some good after I've gone home to put tea bags on my eyes and put my feet up. What I do not want to do here is repeat a convocation moment that I experienced when I was in my very first year of teaching at U of T. I was sitting in the hot June sun in Convocation Hall in U of T in my scratchy academic robe, right behind the honorary graduand who is going to give the big speech. It was a history professor and famous writer called Arthur Lower, A-R-M Lower. He, of course, is a bastion for the defense of English Canada against all invaders. And he was escorted to the stage, and he had glasses like mine. Mine only have 2 parts to them. I think his had many parts to them. And he also had a great big flashlight that he put on the stage. And he started his talk, and he got himself very involved in what he was talking about, which was the invaders coming up the St. Lawrence in order to take over precious Canada before Confederation. And he stepped back and with great valiance reached for his sword to remove it from his scabbard to repel the invaders. And what he repelled was his light and all his notes. And so from then on, Arthur Lower and the rest of the audience were just kind of meandering down the St. Lawrence together in some order. And so, without the drama, that might be what you and I are doing together. But I promise you, I hope that it will be a relatively instructive meander. In 2004, Amnesty International Canada published Stolen Sisters, a human rights response to discrimination and violence against Indigenous women in Canada. The report, part of Amnesty's international campaign identifying violence against Indigenous women as a human rights issue, features 9 case studies heavily concentrated in Western Canada and heavily concentrated in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. We know these stories off by heart, many of them now. The story of Helen Betty Osborne, the story of Pamela George, the story of Janet Henry and Sarah DeVries, who were victims of Willie Picton, the young girl from Winnipeg, Felicia Velvet Solomon, a relative of Helen Betty Osborne, and so on. And Amnesty says in its report, in every instance, it is Amnesty International's view that Canadian authorities should have done more to ensure the safety of these women and girls. They have identified a number of features in their report that they say are central to what has happened to these young girls and women. And crucial among them is the indifference, or indeed the hostility of authorities to the claims for safety of Indigenous women in this country. So let me take you now to the first of these, of my first bit of my English literature homework, and that is The Ecstasy of Rita Jo. George Riga's play, The Ecstasy of Rita Jo, opened at the Vancouver Playhouse in November 1967. In 1969, the play was the opening play for the studio theatre of the new National Arts Centre and was adapted as a ballet by the Royal Winnipeg Ballet in 1971. This is no fly-by-night play. This is a central play in English Canadian literature. The Canadian Theatre Encyclopedia says of the play that it was one of the first works about Native Canadians mounted on a stage and taken seriously. Brian Parker of the Graduate Drama Centre at the University of Toronto observes that as the enthusiasm of its Vancouver and Ottawa audience attests, well done, it is perhaps the most moving play that Canada has produced. A review in BC Scene magazine described it as widely considered the first distinctively English Canadian play. And what was it telling us in 1967 about Indigenous women and the violence against them? What was it telling us that in the intervening years we have somehow unlearned? The setting for this play is a magistrate's courtroom in Vancouver. Rita Jo is brought before the magistrate on her 7th charge under the Vag C provisions of the Criminal Code in 1 year. Vag C is a notorious old section in which provided that everyone commits vagrancy who, being a common prostitute or night walker, is found in a public place and does not, when required, give a good account of herself. This is one of the only instances in Canadian criminal law where what you were was part of the offense. This was a status crime. There were attempts to challenge Vag C under the Canadian Bill of Rights and the Dry Bones case, and these were unsuccessful. The courts in British Columbia held that if dry bones were to be interpreted to mean that there is discrimination by reason of sex unless every crime contained in the criminal code applies to both males and females, then a number of sections of the criminal code are inoperative, and indeed, the criminal law of Canada is now in an emasculated, chaotic state. This provision put a premium on the word of the arresting police officer, for it was that officer who requested the good account, and it was that officer who would then testify that the accused had failed to provide one. It cannot be escaped that such a section gave the police extraordinary power over the population of persons subject to the charge. The magistrate lectures Rita Jo, an Indigenous woman from up the BC coast, on how to avoid being arrested. You have to wash, he scolds. You can't walk around in old clothes and running shoes made of canvas. You have to have some money in your pockets and an address where you live. You should fix your hair, perhaps even change your name, and try to tame that accent that sounds like you have a mouthful of sawdust. In other words, don't be an Indigenous woman and conform to stereotypes of middle-class female respectability. Rita Jo responds to the charge by telling the magistrate that she was going home, trying to find the highway. She says, I knew those two were cops the moment I saw them. I told them to go effing fly a kite. They got sore and then started pushing me around. They followed me around until a third cop drove up, and then they arrested me. They stuffed $5 bills in my pockets when they had me in the car. She challenges the magistrate. I ask you, mister, when are they going to charge cops like that with contributing to delinquency? The magistrate intones. Don't blame the police, Rita Jo. The obstacles to your life are here in your thoughts, perhaps even in your culture. The magistrate makes clear his views that Rita Jo's fate in the city is entirely her own fault. He says, the cities are open to you to come and go as you wish, yet you gravitate to the slums and skid rows and the shantytown fringes. You become a whore, drunkard, user of narcotics, at best dying of illness or malnutrition, at worst kicked or beaten to death by some angry white scum who finds in you something lower than himself to pound his frustrations out on. What's to be done? You Indians seem to be incapable of taking action to help yourselves. Interwoven with these harsh and racist scenes of Rita Jo's humiliation and her stalking unto death in the magistrate's courtroom are flashbacks to Rita Jo's childhood up country. These vignettes show a strong family in which her father resists local challenges to give his daughter up for adoption to a childless settler couple, and tries to resist the machinations of missionaries and Indian agents. These vignettes show the wrongful attribution to Rita Jo of rampant sexuality by a discontented grade 4 teacher, and sexual predation against her by local youth and her employer. At first, these seem like stereotypes, but placed in the context of a host of stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country, they take on a distinct air of reality. How can we, I think, have heard these stories in 1967, have seen them on the stage, and yet have forgotten them? The sexual exploitation of her employer in the tire store at home explains why she did not pursue a promising employment there, and they make a strong link between sexual violence and Rita Jo's inability to escape poverty. In his introduction, Brian Parker tells us Rita Jo's destruction is a commonplace. In Vancouver alone, an average of 20 such girls die each year. This is 1967, and we are talking about a commonplace in the city of Vancouver. We are talking about it, but nobody, if they listened, nobody remembered. Chief Dan George, who played Rita Jo's father, David Jo, in the premiere of the play and in its subsequent Ottawa performance, says, "The message of Rita Jo is true. This I wish to make clear. The message is true. Of this there is no doubt, and it should be heard by all. Chief George observes that when the play opened in Ottawa, people came to us to say that now, for the first time, they understood a little of what the Native peoples have suffered and are suffering. He is pleased about that awareness because the Indian people at this very time need to put their message before Canada because laws are being readied that will affect the Indian for years to come. That, of course, was the White Paper of 1969. Yet Chief George also observes in his intro to the text of the play, it is useless for people to hear if they do not listen with their hearts. One can only conclude upon a review of the 50 or so years since the premiere of the Ecstasy of Rita Jo that if non-Indigenous people were indeed listening to the play, they were not listening with their hearts. We were not listening with our hearts. So let me go now, let me take you briefly now to the Manawanka cycle and Margaret Lawrence. And for me, Margaret Lawrence is a much more problematic figure. For one thing, there is more literature there than one simple play. And for another thing, there are themes in her literature which could be said to be sympathetic to Indigenous peoples. And I don't want to deprive her of the benefit of being recognized for that. But one of the things that I want to mention about Margaret Lawrence is that she is very much an unfinished piece of work. She has spent at least 2 novels, The Fire Dwellers and The Diviners, setting out intricately the story of the Tonnerre family, originally from Galloping Mountain and latterly of Manawanka, Quebec, and then of variously Vancouver and traveling different spots in the rest of Canada. And yet we have a sense, after reading all of these stories, that Margaret Lawrence never really came to grips with the people that she had created. She had never really come to grips with the Tonnerre family, and she had never really come to grips with the situation of Indigenous peoples as represented by them. One of the reasons I say this is because perhaps the most powerful aspect of what Margaret Lawrence tells us is what she does not tell us. Morag Gunn, the protagonist of The Diviners and an occasional character in some of the other stories, has a child, Peak, with Métis Jules Skinner Tonnerre. The Tonnerre family is Métis. Not only are they without land to speak of, as Margaret Lawrence writes them up, they are without land claims. They have culture, yes, and the stories and the history and the poetry and the music of their culture are meeting places between Jules Tonnerre, his sometime lover Morag Gunn, and their daughter Peak. And a very elaborate symbolism connects them. But nowhere, for example, does Lawrence tell us that the real version, the original model for Galloping Mountain, which is the home territory of the Tonnerres and their historic place that they go to take refuge from the world, has been the subject of a contested First Nation land claim for many, many decades. It is now a national park. It was made a national park in spite of known and existing Indigenous land claims. The land in Margaret Lawrence, the land and its role in Indigenous self-determination are hidden. Lawrence's main female protagonist, Morag Gunn from The Diviners, is also landless, the ward of the keeper of the town garbage ground, which in the diviners is called the nuisance grounds. That man has powerful tales of the landless settlers driven from Scotland, and they're coming to Manitoba via the icy port of Churchill, and of the inspiring piper gun who leads them on to their new place of settlement. Morag is, in other words, at least not a member of the land-grabbing class. When she does get land, she gets it in another province altogether, Ontario, and doesn't steal it from the Métis. But what is critical here in this story of Morag and Jules is that the possibility of a cultural and familial connection between Jules and Morag is facilitated by the fact that Morag and her people have not been implicated in the theft of Tonnerre land. They are not helping to get the land back, but they are also not the ones who dispossess the Tonnerres. I believe that Margaret Lawrence would be happy to leave things there, where important cultural statements are made and connections are built, but there is no land base, there's no restitution of historical wrongs. We are only dealing with the connection in an artistic way of two cultures. The only place where I can find in Margaret Lawrence's Manawaca cycle where the actual issue of Indigenous land is mentioned is the story of the Fire Dwellers, first published in 1969. And this was done before the Calder case, decided by the Supreme Court of Canada in 1973, recognized the possibility, or recognized that there is an Indigenous interest in land. The heroine of the Fire Dwellers, Stacey Cameron McKendra, who left Manawaca, Manitoba, and became a confused Vancouver housewife living in the suburbs, takes a lover who tells her about going up country in BC to see native villages. They are dry and ancient as dust, he says, and their inhabitants stare with implacable hatred at the tourists who come to see totem poles. One wonders how many of these tourists, like Stacey Cameron McKendra's lover himself, wear Cowichan sweaters when they come to do the tour of the totem poles. These villages are rare in the Manawaca cycle. We see them only in 2 or 3 glimpses in this Fire Dwellers. Because the Manawaca cycle does not deal with Aboriginal as distinct from Métis rights and does not deal with land. Lawrence's brief mention of these small villages on the coast of British Columbia does them no justice whatsoever, even though what she does with them, consigning them to the old cracked pages of Canadian touristic history, fits in very well with the sensibility of what the Canadian government thought. The Canadian government in the White Paper in 1969, issued the same year as the Fire Dwellers came out, was not prepared to recognize any native title whatsoever beyond what was in the Indian Act. And so Lawrence is very true to her time in that sense, but nonetheless, her failure to come to grips at all with the issue of land, but to concentrate only on certain kind of cultural exchanges, as if we were on like a happy bus tour through a few landmarks with a mixed crew, is very unsatisfying. Nonetheless, what we do find in Margaret Lawrence is something similar to what we find in the stories of violence against Indigenous women that are echoed and that echoed throughout the Ecstasy of Rita Jo. I just want to read you one excerpt, then I want to talk about another. Morag Gunn's daughter, Peak, is at home one day. She is a high school student, and she is angry. And she tells her mother that she wants to quit school. And she says, I just can't see much use in what they're teaching, that's all. So her mother presses her about why she wants to quit. And then she says, what do you know of it? You've never been called a dirty half-breed. You've never had somebody tell you your mother was crazy because she lived out here alone and wrote dirty books and had kooky people coming out from the city to visit. Have you? Have you? And then Pete gets to the nub of her concerns. Yeah, well, it was just that this guy, a real smartass, came up and started making these passes at me, see? And when I more or less told him to get lost, he said, "Aw, come on, don't give me that shit. You know half-breed girls can't wait to get fucked by any guy who comes along." And this is Morag saying to herself in her head, oh, Jesus. God damn, Morag says furiously, who was he? I am going to go and see the principal. No, Ma, don't. The guy's dad is on the school board. It won't do any good to see the principal. He'd be sorry and all that, but he couldn't do anything. Yeah, maybe a person's got to put up a fight, but not that way. And then in what I call peak number 2, the second story of Peak, which digs so deeply into what we know of the experience of the missing and murdered Aboriginal women of Canada. She goes as a teenager hitchhiking out west to Manitoba to see some of her father's relatives, and later she tells her mother of hitchhiking along and being bothered by young men along the road. She is wearing her knapsack. They bother her. They try to pick her up in their car. They make, racist comments and sexist comments at her. And she eventually seeks help from the local police. And who winds up in the cell? She does. And this story, for me, her story of being on her journey to find her relatives in Manitoba as a teenage girl, speaks so eloquently to what Margaret Lawrence knew and did not know, what she told us and what we did not remember, because this story picks up the story of Helen Betty Osborne, who was bothered and taken away and killed by young men out for a toot one night. She was a high school girl who was a respectable young woman, was murdered by young men looking for some hot sex from an Indigenous young woman. This happened in 1971, and it was not until 1991 that the Manitoba Justice Inquiry got to the bottom of this. It was not until many years after 1971 that there was even any kind of indication or admission that these men knew what they had done. It was not until much, much later that their relatives, who had sheltered them, who had covered up for them, finally allowed the story to come out. And that same thing happened with the death of Pamela George. 2 young guys, university guys, drunk and out on a toot, kill a young woman. Their mothers help them get away, and they are eventually arrested in British Columbia, in a story that is so similar to what Margaret Lawrence tells us about what happened to Peak, although Peak lived. So these young men are arrested and brought home for trial. The defense lawyer of one of them is Fred Kovacs, and he and the other defense lawyer talk about the boys, about these young men, about, don't be too hard on them because they made a mistake. So they were out for a night on the town, and this was the way they chose to have their night on the town. they were convicted and they did spend jail time. And one of the defense lawyers, Mr. Kovacs, became Justice Kovacs of the Queen's Bench. And many years later, in Melfort, Saskatchewan, when a 13-year-old girl was picked up by 3 men in their 20s who gang raped her, Mr. Justice Kovacs presided over at least one of the trials of these young men. And throughout the trial, he referred to them as the young men, or the boys, and referred to her as Ms. X. There is a direct link between what Margaret Lawrence was writing about and what she knew and what all her readers knew in the early 70s, when The Diviners was Canada's #1 best-selling novel, bringing honor and glory to Canadian literature around the world. There is a direct link between that and the story of Helen Betty Osborne and the story of Pamela George and the story of how Mr. Justice Kovacs treated the 3 men in their 20s who had gang raped a girl who was running away from home because she had been abused by her stepfather. We are not listening with our hearts, English Canada. We are simply not listening with our hearts. So what are we going to do about this? Haven't we given, isn't 50 years or 60 years long enough for these stories to sink in? What should we do? Well, looking at current developments in the news with respect to violence against Indigenous women, my first suggestion is, well, it's urgent that we have a National Commission of Inquiry about the missing and murdered Native women, instead of the travesty of a commission that Wally Opal has been appointed to head up in Vancouver. But then I say to myself, there doesn't need to be an inquiry. We know